All right, so welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about imaginary numbers. In this section, we're going to talk about how to take the square root of negative numbers, and then just how to simplify square roots. So at this point, the square root of a negative number is always something we call undefined, so we couldn't find the square root of a negative number. The actual answer to that is just a bit more complex. When we deal with square roots of negative numbers, we use this term I. I is equal to the square root of negative 1. And so that's how we deal with the negative signs inside the square root. So for example, as you can see there, we have the square root of negative 4, which is the same thing as the square root of 4 times the square root of negative 1. And we know that the square root of 4 can be plus or minus 2, and the square root of negative 1 is just I. And so the square root of negative 4 would be plus or minus 2i. So let's try a few of these. We want to express the following square roots in terms of I. Okay, so the square root of negative 6 is the same thing as the square root of 6 times the square root of negative 1. We can't simplify the square root of 6, so we just leave it square root of 6 times I. Okay. Remember that square roots can have two values, right? So 2 times 2 will give you 4. But negative 2 times negative 2 will also give you positive 4. And so for each of these square roots, we really should get plus or minus square root of 6 times I. Similarly, the square root of negative 121 is the same thing as the square root of 121 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of 121 is plus or minus 11. And the square root of negative 1 is I. And finally, the square root of negative 25, same thing as the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1, which is plus or minus 5i. And so when we take the square root of a negative number, we use i's to represent that negative part. So one thing that we'll have to do throughout this chapter in the equations that we're going to solve is simplifying square roots. Okay, so it's also helpful and in some cases necessary whenever you're putting your answers into the computer that you simplify these square roots. Okay, we're going to use this throughout the next section of this chapter. So first we want to find the largest perfect square using a list that I've given you that will divide evenly into the given number, and then split the root up based on the largest perfect square. So let's try some examples. The square root of 75. Well, the largest perfect square that will divide into 75 is 25. And so we can rewrite this as the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And we know the square root of 25 is plus or minus 5. And then we just leave the square root of 3. So it's plus or minus 5 times the square root of 3. Similarly, the square root of 216. The largest perfect square that divides into 216 is 36. And so we get 36 times 6. And then if we take the square root of 36, we get 6 times the square root of 6. Finally, the square root of 128. The largest perfect square that divides into 128 is 64. And so we get the square root of 64 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 64 is 8 times the square root of 2. I left off the plus and minus on the last two examples. The plus or minus really depends on the type of problem that you're doing as to whether you're going to use both answers or just one. So if the numbers are negative, right, then we can simplify the roots the same way, except we have to include the I as well. So for example, the square root of negative 50, that's the same thing as the square root of 25 times the square root of 2 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of 25 is 5. We don't do anything to the square root of 2. And the square root of negative 1 just becomes I. This can be written in different ways because it's all multiplication. And so those two things are equal to each other. The thing to notice is that the I is not under the square root. I will never be under a square root. So the square root of negative 147, the square root of negative 147, that's the square root of 49 times the square root of 3 times the square root of negative 1, which is 7 times the square root of 3 times I. And finally, the square root of negative 12, the square root of 4 times the square root of 3 times the square root of negative 1. Square root of 4 is 2, so we get 2 times the square root of 3 times I. So once again, I is never under the square root. So at the end of this lesson, you should be able to take the square root of a negative number using that I, and you should be able to simplify square roots.